Hey y'all, I'm here again. Another Monday has arrived. It's kind of gloomy outside, and so I had to set up my lighting accordingly. And so I got a few little tales to tell you today. And I'm going to jump right into this thing. This was the first time I went to the Power Stroke rally, and they allowed us on that first trip to the assembly plant to actually take cameras into the assembly plant and take pictures. And then I went to the Craftsman truck race, and I have made this little video here, and the music that I have playing behind it is copyrighted music, and so if I posted this on YouTube, I probably would get smacked down or whatever. But one way or another, you can see I had a whale of a good time up there. I was in the pit, talking to the mechanics and all that. I learned an awful lot on that trip, but it was a pretty cool thing. The Power Stroke truck won that year. It's August 2002, Craftsman truck race. You can look it up. But this was the first Motor Age Garage article that I ever had published. It was in May of 2000, and it was about a job I did on a Power Stroke. And after that, it was like everybody wanted Power Stroke articles, and I got hired in 2003 to go and teach some Power Stroke diesel classes in Fort Worth for the for the association out there, Automotive Service Association, whatever it was, the ASP or whatever. And then I taught down in Houston and all that. But this article and the other ones that I wrote, and I also wrote some for Power Stroke Registry and all that. That was kind of funny. I wrote an article about, just pulled up everything that I knew from working on those things for 6 or 7 years, and everything I learned about them and all the tricks and everything. And it was funny because I sent that thing to Motor Age, and they said, this is an 8,000 word article. There's no way on earth we're going to be able to publish it. But this guy over here that publishes Power Stroke Registry might be willing to, but he doesn't pay much of anything. And so I sent him the article, and I asked him if he wanted to buy it, and he paid me a lot of money for that article because he was so excited to get it. Anyway, this right here is what it looked like if you current ramp the second generation 7.3 Power Stroke. You can pinpoint a bad injector. Of course, I used to like to do the buzz test. A lot of the time on a buzz test, you would hear them go, they would count through injectors 1 through 8, buzzing them when you were in your buzz test routine that you did with a scan tool. But there was a guy that I met out in Texas that had started current ramping all of his, and he noticed that this little hump right here, and this hump has got to do with how the pintle moves and that kind of thing. And so, this initial kick is to raise the pintle off of its seat, and then this second little Bart Simpson head is basically to hold it. But if you saw that line coming down, if it's ragged and ugly like that, when you're current ramping one of these, instead of being pretty and straight like that one, that's a problem injector. It was very difficult for a while to pick out an injector that was causing a problem, because sometimes, even though there was a misfire going on with one of those 7.3s, it was very hard to pick it out. I mean, the buzz test wouldn't always catch it, and you didn't have a good way to do it. And I say, what if we could kill the injectors one at a time while we were listening to it, or maybe looking at some readings or something like that. And so you might remember the earlier Power Strokes had these. The later Power Strokes had a longer connector that had all of these, for 4 injectors and 4 glow plugs on. But this one right here had two connectors like this on the valve cover, and 2 connectors on the harness like that. And so I got a project box, and I got some valve covers that I had replaced that had these connectors on them. And you might notice down here, this actually is going to the injector, and that was going to the glow plug. There's some more. There's another couple of them over like that. But the simple point is, if you knew what the pinout was, you could basically go in there. I got some connectors, and I got cut some valve covers, and I actually made a harness to plug in between here and here with these 250 volt 20 amp toggle switches, and I put 8 of them on there, and I would number it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and I had my connectors numbered and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I just threw this together in a couple of hours, and so basically what I was doing there, what I would take these injectors right here, 115 volt injectors, you know that if you're familiar with the old 7.3 Power Stroke, the 6 liters went down to 48 volts, and the Duramax has got 93 volt injectors, or the ones that I was originally studying did. But anyway, there's an injector driver module in between the PCM and the injectors, and so I would take this harness connector, and I was going through a toggle switch. The only circuit I was interrupting was the one that was firing each injector, that was triggering it. And so I could turn the injectors off, and I was able to track down a lot of times which injector was the problem child, so that was really an issue there. But the connection that Ford, something else was funny. I sent this idea that I had in the box I had built to Ford and to Hickok, and I said, why don't you build one of these, and that way it'll help these guys pinpoint these. And they said, no, we're not interested in that. Well, they came out with this less than a year later, and it was like $1,000, you know. But now I will tell you, it plugged in at this big square connector over there under the master cylinder. And you can see all the injectors go through there and your power and all. And so, anyway, whenever you plugged in between this and this, they were basically interrupting them with this box right here that had these push buttons here on it, which wasn't so bad. But what you would do is, like for example, cylinder number 3 was disabled on this one using this tester, the mass fuel desired reading, there's also a volume fuel desired reading, so you got mass and volume, and this right here would be milligram. The volume of fuel was measured in cubic millimeters, that basically a little tiny measurement like that. But this is milligrams, this is by weight. And so if you saw this right here, the other one would change a lot. In other words, when you would kill the one that was operating, all the other ones would kick, it would kick up. If I killed the one that was misfiring, this didn't change very much at all, because you're actually reading all of the mass fuel desired reading for the whole engine, not just for one injector on that screen. That was from the Service Bay Diagnostic System, by the way. All right, this was me driving pace trucks at the Craftsman truck race. I did that a couple of times when I went up there. I went several times up to that Power Stroke rally, and it was a heck of a lot of fun. And I got a lot of good information, good photos of cutaway engines and stuff like that. You've probably even, I've actually put some of them on here, some of the cutaway engine photos. This is the first domestic engine I ever rebuilt. It was on a truck almost exactly like that. This is a 64 model Ford, and the one I did was a 62 model, which was slightly different. On a 62 model, this line you see right here went down at a slant instead of going straight back. But that little, it was a straight 6, and it was the first time I had ever worked on one of those. And initially, I got the torque specs wrong, and I was over torquing the rod caps with the torque wrench. And so I had to go back in there, and actually I think I accidentally put a bearing shell around backward, but hey, what the heck, I wasn't but like 17 or whatever, so just learning at the time. And, but anyway, when I saw that truck sitting out there in front of Doc's Country Store where I used to eat lunch every day, I had to take a picture of it because it reminded me, it was the same color as the truck that I did my first motor overhaul on. And if you remember your first motor overhaul, the first time you did one by yourself, you got it all put back together and you fired that thing up, there was nothing that quite felt like that. Everybody that's listening to this has ever rebuilt an engine knows what I'm talking about. The first time you heard an engine start that you had rebuilt, it gave you a special feeling like you had never had any other time. Universal, this is a universal thing on OBD2 connectors. These are ground. This is pins 4 and 5, and they're numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way down to 16. This is always B plus, and this is always B minus. So you're going to have a couple of grounds here, and you're going to have power here. These other ones are used for various different things, different buses and all that kind of thing, and you could actually pull up a pattern of those. But I took a picture of that, and I put that together like that. This was why the Chevy truck tail lights didn't work one day. We were trying to figure out why they weren't operating. Well, we went and plugged back here at this junction block on the side. This had got all chalky, and that terminal had broke off. This actually plugged in that way, and so look at that. That terminal just came off, and we wound up with no connection there because of that. And so anyway, that was what I had to tell this guy right here. I said, we can order you one of these junction blocks, because I don't want to go to the trouble to rewire all this garbage. So I told him, you're going to get one of those junction blocks, and you're going to get a connector pigtail like that one there. He don't want to spend any money. That was the problem with that, because he probably figured, how much can it cost to fix the taillights, Well, this is the reason for the P0401 code on Fords. Everybody that's ever worked on a P0401 code, not just on Fords, but you'll see this on GMs and on just about everybody else, because you're going to see this gummy stuff. This is the same kind of gummy nonsense. It steams up in there from the PCV system, and it settles all over everything. Then it winds up being carried up in there, and it clogs up these ports. So you're wound up. It actually looks for an RPM drop or various different, on some of them. When you're running their self-test, on the earlier ones, I remember the V8. It was a strange thing. Whenever you're running a self-test on these Fords, you would actually hear it. When it was testing EGR, you'd hear it lose some RPM. Of course, it's also looking at a DPFE sensor, which is the voltage is going to go up on that whenever there's EGR flowing. General Motors used to like to watch the oxygen sensor because it would tend to drift a little bit to the rich part. Whenever it triggered EGR, it would watch the oxygen sensor, and it could tell if it was flowing that way. That was the feedback even before OBD2 on that. And it was the DPFE sensor was before OBD2 on the Ford, but they already had feedback for EGR. But when you were running the self-test on the V8s, like in your Mercury Mountaineers, they had a 302 in them, it never opened that EGR. I mean, we were checking that. Donnie and me were looking at that. But rather than opening the EGR, it would do something to cause the RPM to drop a little bit as if the EGR was opening. And that way it would be fooled. It was fooling itself into thinking the EGR was working. That was the craziest thing I'd ever seen anybody do. It's vaguely like the Volkswagen people trying to trick out the emission stuff on their diesel, I guess. But that was only on the V8 Mountaineers that they would do that in the Explorers. But sometimes on these pickup trucks, you see that stuff, actually growing in there. You have to clean that stuff out and run a long drill down in there and wash all that mess. It was real aggravating. And this right here is on your Crown Vickies. You could take that off and clean that out really fast to get rid of the P0401 code. But I don't know how many of those things that we had to do. This right here, when I was demystifying fuel injection for students, I built that ignition board, but I used the signal from this to trigger the engine controller. This was before I built that brown board that had all the injectors and everything on it. And I put it on these plexiglass boards, and I'd lay it out, and I would have the students use jumper wires to wire all that up, even to the point of hooking up a scan tool so you could read the RPM, and you could basically watch the injectors click, and you could open the throttle, because I had a throttle body on here too, and you could watch the pulse width expand and all that kind of thing. And so basically you're just showing them how this is really nothing except an electrical machine, and it's taking inputs and applying outputs to it. Not a whole lot to that. This guy right here was a really successful guy. He's still in the field out there making a lot of money working at a dealer not far from here. This right here is why the Taurus wouldn't move. The transmission, the little old shafts that drive that fluid pump on those AXOD transmissions, some of the front wheel drive Taurus transmissions, the AX4N, whatever, they will break like that. And this one here, whenever it popped, you had no pump drive, you got no pump, you got no pressure, you got no pressure, you got no application of, you don't fill up your converter, you don't do anything, you don't go anywhere, all because of that one. Now that is a sort of a weak link in that chain. It's really important to have that pump, obviously, and if they make this shaft that crappy and that weak so that it breaks like that, well, that's a crummy deal. That's what happened to that one right there. Sometimes you just have to take a picture. I sat in traffic and I saw this looks like about a 1920 model or something. I'm not quite as sharp on old cars enough to tell you exactly what year model that is. Somebody else probably could. But I had to take a photo of that car. Some cars you just want to take a picture of. And so I was able to pull the camera off my belt and snap a picture of that one while he was sitting in a traffic light. This right here is the way they used to work on those cars when they were new. You notice this guy's got a chain fall hooked up to this thing, he had a couple of hooks right here hooked to the front axle, and he raised it up, and he's just standing under it, you know, doing the work that he needed to do. But you can see he's got pistons here. This guy's doing an engine overhaul. Now, in the olden days, when these cars were really old, about every 10,000 miles, you had to put rings in them because they hadn't perfected engine science to the point that they have now. And these things would just, they needed a heck of a lot of work to keep them going. And that was something that that guy was obviously doing right there. I don't know how much he got paid, but that guy right there, you know, he's a professional technician, and he's got to pan off the engine and the pistons out of it and all that kind of thing. This right here is a fire ring failure on a head gasket. Compression migrates into the coolant jacket whenever the fire ring fails that way. So basically what you're going to get is you're going to get compression going into this, you know, this is where coolant goes through there. You're going to get compression going in here, and it's basically going to build up pressure. That's when you put your, when you suspect that this is going on, you take one of your nitrile gloves and you rubber band it onto the radiator neck or the coolant bottle neck, and you fire it up. And if that thing starts building pressure within a minute or so and blowing that, you know, when you started the engine cold, and you start seeing that thing inflate that glove, you're going to know you got some compression getting in there, and it's getting past that fire ring. Now, that's not the only way head gaskets can blow. All right, these head gaskets can also blow so that they seep coolant into the cylinder, and that's another way they can blow. There's several different ways, and they can also blow between cylinders. But if you move the light, this is the same gasket. See, this is, you can see this if you got a sharp eye and you know what you're looking at, but you can see it a heck of a lot better by moving the light over here so that there's a shadow. And you can see the difference in moving the light, how much better you can see what's going on here than you can here. I mean, that's the same picture and all that. And that's coolant migration into the cylinder here. But just kind of keep it. I love to do that when I'm looking at, last time I was talking about scraping the gasket. When you want to make sure that your gasket services, if there's any way you can, get your flashlight, get an LED light, get some kind of a light, and shine it across it at an angle, and you'll see shadows that will reveal stuff you never knew was there. That's what was going on here. See this right here, this same little ridge is here, but look how it makes it stand out in relief whenever you shine the light from the side. That's just a smart way to do that. Today's dead in the grass car is a 2007 Camry. You gotta love it. You know, you go driving, it's like an 03 model. There's no, you know, you might feel like if you know these cars here, you know, why on earth would this car here be sitting in the grass? You know, because those are pretty good cars, actually. Now, it did have that 2.4, you know, in it with the chain-driven cams and all that. I don't know what happened. Maybe it ran out of oil. Maybe somebody just parked it and never started it again. I wonder about these things. Every time I see a car sitting there that looks like it was once a pretty good car, they don't have to sit there very long either before the gas in the tank goes rotten and everything is just, you know, entropy didn't hurt old cars the way it does new ones, because new ones have got so many expensive components on them that rotten gas will ruin things, so that it has just, a lot of stuff has to be replaced. But you can't say it every time it's going to do that, but usually it will. Now, can you identify this vehicle? These were the diagnostic connectors. They were down there under the hood, and you had to plug in these two to get to that. I'm going to let somebody tell me. Now, this actually is going to be really, really, really familiar to some people, and there are some people who are going to say, I have never seen anything like that. This is obviously pre-OBD2, and it was one of those proprietary connections that you had to make, and this prevailed for, I'm going to say, 10 years in one particular car line, or a couple of car lines that were owned by the same outfit. I also, once you look at these connectors here, I always hated these split connectors like this. You know, Ford used some of those. General Motors has used some of them. These round split connectors, because when you plug them and unplug them enough times, they start to get loose and they get to where they don't make good connections and all that. But I worked on these things right here for a lot of years, and just if you can identify that, you know, whenever you weren't working with this, you're supposed to cover those up so that, you know, there was a little yellow cap like that. It covered this one up and this one up, so that you didn't get stuff in there. But I'm just going to let that be a mystery for a little while. You know, if you send me a message on this video and let me know if you know what you're looking at there. Some people will, other people won't. This power steering I thought was very interesting. This was from 63 to 79 Corvette power steering, and it had a cylinder here that was basically helping you with steering. You just mounted like a dadgum steering damper if you get right down to it. But you notice it's got hydraulic lines going to it, and so that it can help you steer it. This is a renewal kit that you can buy from one source I found online, where it comes with a new, this thing here new, and it comes with that little valving, for the steering, and then these lines. And that was that $430 renewal kit. If you're a Corvette person, I guess that you would already know about all this. But I thought that was an incredibly interesting way that GM did that. They did stuff different on Corvettes and Cadillacs, GM did, than they did just about any other car. Some of you might remember back in the day whenever, if you had a Buick, a Pontiac, an Oldsmobile, or Chevrolet, or a Cadillac, like on the Buick, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, and Chevrolet, you might have 350 engines in 4 cars that were sitting there, but every 350 engine was different. A Buick 350 was not like a Pontiac, and a Pontiac was not like an Oldsmobile, and an Oldsmobile was not like a Chevrolet. All those engines were different. They even have different bolt patterns on the transmission. And you could typically, if you were pretty sharp on those things, you could walk up and open the hood and just glance at it. Now GM started dropping 350 Chevy engines in a lot of their other makes of cars. There was lawsuits that flew around about that. And finally they just said, look, we build in the car, we're going to put any engine in it we want to, and you can stick it in your ear if you don't like it. But they got to the point where people were having Chevrolet engines that they were getting in Buicks and stuff like that, because if the assembly line was running behind on the Buick engines, they'd pop a 350 Chevy in there, and of course they had to put a different transmission in it and all that. But if you looked at the valve covers and where the distributor was, like for example on a Buick, the distributor would tend to be in the front, but on a Pontiac it was in the back, and then the Chevrolet and the Pontiac and the Oldsmobile, if I remember right, they were in the back, and then the Buick tended to have it in the front. Some of the Buick V6s had it in the front driving the oil pump. You could take the plate off of the oil pump with the car right there on the rack and see those gears. And on some of those late 70s Buicks, if you piddled around and took too long to change the oil pump wouldn't pick up a prime whenever you started it back up. So what we used to do was take that plate off the oil pump, which was on the opposite end of where the distributor went down by the timing cover, and we would smear a bunch of grease in there so those gears would have a suction to pull oil back up in there. Anyway, that's another story. I could ramble for a while. This is a look you get when the third customer waiting RO comes and you aren't yet done with the other 2. What do you think about that? I used to see that all the time when I was, there was a time when I was the only drivability guy and I was having to work out 12, 15 cars a day, and the dispatcher was a wacky sort of a guy that was real fastidious about this, that, and the other, and he was his job was to issue the tickets out to everybody. And so he would throw me all these customer waitings, and I usually would work out about a car an hour for the most part, and I didn't have time to sell tune-ups or anything. I was just having to fix what was wrong, get rid of black smoke, all that kind of thing. Well, occasionally he would give me a job that was going to slow me down to the point of where I was going to have a bunch of angry customers. And so he would, his name was Dennis, and he'd come up there, and he also was kind of crabby. When you'd go up there, we used to laugh about it, and we'd say, you make a horrible waitress, because sometimes you'd walk up to the window where he was, and he'd say, I'll be with you in a minute, and he'd walk away. And then he'd say, you just go have to wait, But I went up there one day, and some of the little 2.9s that were coming out in Ford Rangers and little Bronco 2s developed an issue where the intake gasket would slip and it would draw oil from the crankcase, from the valley, and it would start pumping oil out one of the cylinders because it was pulling it. You'd have, obviously if the intake gasket slipped, it would pull oil past the slipped gasket, and you could look down there. They didn't put gaskets on the exhaust. They would just basically have a machined surface with the exhaust manifold bolted right up to the head. Now it didn't typically work all that well after the thing had some miles on it, because when you put the exhaust manifold back on, there'd be a little bit of an exhaust leak there. So gaskets were made for that purpose, but they didn't come with gaskets. But the fact that they didn't come with gaskets, even though they were low mileage, that oil, if you looked and you saw the number 6 cylinder on the driver's side back, if you saw that thing weeping oil out there where the manifold was bolted up to the head, you'd know that thing was pulling oil, because it was a really low mileage vehicles when they were doing that. Well, the dispatcher one day gave me one of these intake gasket jobs. I mean, he was just throwing them at everybody because there's a bunch of things. And so I was just getting started on it, and the shop foreman came over there, and he wanted me to have really a smooth workflow of all these electronics and drivability problems, so that we wouldn't have a bunch of angry customers up there in the waiting room tapping their foot. And they kind of got spoiled because I was knocking them out so fast, you know. If you're doing the same work over, I mean, on the same make and models, you know, makes and models of cars, you know, all the different ones, you get really good at it, so you can do it really, really fast, and that's how you turn more hours, that's how you make more money. And you know, there's this, some people are saying, well, you know, if it didn't take him 2 hours to do, then I don't want to pay 2 hours labor. Well, the simple fact is, if you're really good at your job, you can actually turn 2 hours labor in 30 minutes if you've done the job enough to where you know exactly what to do, where to go, what to do, which tools to pull out, how to get that job done fast, and that's how commission mechanics make a good living. But Dennis throws me this intake job, and there's several other guys doing these intake jobs because there's so many of them. And you got to remember, these were new vehicles, so all the bolts were fresh and new and all that kind of thing. So Philip comes over there and he says, how did you wind up with this job? And I said, well, the dispatcher gave it to me. He said that he needed it done, and so I was going to go ahead and knock it out for him. And so he says, well, I don't want you tied up on this, so get through with it as quick as you can. And besides that, these other guys are getting started on a couple of these, and you don't want them to get through before you do. And he played me, you know. And I said, oh man, I can't let these guys beat me on one of these jobs. And I didn't even tell them. They didn't even know that we were competing. But I went to work with my air tools on that thing. I was pulling, and I put everything back together, and I got that gasket in there just right, and torqued everything, and got it all put back together. It's a really sweet, easy job. But I got everything plugged back in. I reached in there and started that vehicle up, and I looked over there at these other guys, and they were just taking their intakes off. I thought, wow, okay, I guess I got played by the shop woman. Anyway, I went outside and went and got another drivability job. But that kind of thing, whenever those drivability, I had mentioned that before, I think, but what happens is, if you get to the point of where you know, either by measuring voltages, which is how I started out figuring out what to do, if you can measure the voltages on a lot of good cars, you can very rapidly measure the voltages on a car it's got a problem, and instantly you see something. That's also true with scan tools, scoping, anything you want to do. Whenever the SBDS machine first came out doing, you know, giving me scope patterns and all, sometimes I would be confused when I looked at a scope pattern to the point to where, unless I compared it with another vehicle just like that one, I wouldn't know what kind of a problem it was. I mean, you know, what the problem was by just glancing at the scope pattern. If you don't have a frame of reference in your mind, that's why it's so important to have scope patterns that you can access, so you'll know what the pattern is supposed to look like. Just looking at the lines on the screen, if you're not familiar with it, you're going to get in trouble trying to read a scope. But if somebody has given you, this is how it's supposed to look, and you can compare that to what you got, you know basically what you need to do to straighten it all out. But the other thing too, being able to figure out what you need to do to gather the proper amount of data to make this thing come together for you. Like if you gather and sort out the data, for example, on the head gasket issue, like I was talking about. There's a video on my channel here about how I had showed the students how there was a vehicle that I knew that had a head gasket that was getting compression into the water. And so what we did was we pulled all the spark plugs out except one, and we filled the coolant all the way up, and we spun it over and watched the coolant in the radiator. And so when we got to the one that had the blown gasket, when we spun it over, it made bubbles and geysers bounce out of the radiator. So we had pinpointed the cylinder that was causing the problem. And at the same time, you know, I made a neat little 1-minute video out of that. It's somewhere on my channel here. But in his entitled head gasket or something. I put the thing on there years ago, but one way or another, being able to gather the right amount of information and sort that out and decide what you need to do. And also sometimes you'll get information that looks like bad information when actually it's not bad enough to cause a problem. I had that one Toyota one time, and I was looking at the factory shop manual material, and they were giving you hard numbers on what the vane airflow, it's an old Toyota, what the vane airflow numbers were supposed to look like. And they said, if your numbers don't look like these, then you need another vane airflow meter. And I checked the voltage like they said, and it was way out of kilter. But I was thinking, you know, that vane airflow meter is $800. I mean, I'm not one of these kind of people that, you know, looks under the daylight to find my keys, even though I lost them in the dark. But at the same time, you better make darn sure that's what your trouble is before you go buy an $800 part that may not fix it. And so on that particular one, I found something else that was the problem, and I was really glad that I didn't spend $800 on a vane airflow meter and all that. But anyway, sometimes what they teach you at the school, at factory school, is not quite as accurate as you wish it would be either. Another thing is if you've got stacked problems. If you stack, I used to stack bugs sometimes when I was bugging vehicles for students to work on. I would bend the spark plug gap and shut and dip it in a little bit of oil so it wouldn't fire, and then I would go to the engine controller and I would pull back the pin feeding that same injector so that they would have no fuel injection, but they also didn't have any spark, and they would find what they thought was the problem and get really excited, and then when they started it up, it's still skipping on that cylinder. Some of us have seen that kind of thing in the service bay. It's really something how that kind of stuff can come together and happen for you and throw you for a loop. But the other thing that would happen for these guys was this one character was used to chasing the bugs I would plant, and he got to where he was pretty good at that. And so I had a Crown Victoria cop car out there that had been donated by the city that had an engine skip on cylinder number 2 because of a mechanical problem. It had low compression on that cylinder for whatever reason. I didn't ever dig into why. It had something to do with the valve or rings. I don't know what it was. But I pulled it in there and I said, I want you to troubleshoot this and find out why it's skipping. And he worked and worked and worked and worked, and he looked at spark plugs and injectors and all that. And then he says, I just don't know what you did to this thing. And I said, have you checked the compression? He says, why would I want to check the compression? I said, just check the compression. And so he checked the compression, and it had low compression on that cylinder. And he goes, well, how did you do that? I said, I didn't do that. The car's got a problem. But the problem with chasing bugs is, if you don't plant the bugs the right way, then they'll be handicapped by looking at everything that comes in like it's a planted bug. And so rather than trying to outthink you, they need to basically objectively go and find the problem if you're an instructor. If you're not an instructor, then you're going to get really, I don't know how you can put that, you're going to get bumfuddled by trying to plant bugs and teach people how to fix cars. You can talk to them like I'm doing you to right here, but if you don't show them, and if they don't do it on their own without somebody helping them, and they're going to have a hard time figuring out what's wrong. That's why we did so much live work when I was teaching over there. Anyway, here's the last slide I got right here. It's pretty darn cool. This gal here was driving, racing, and winning races in the mid-1960s. Isn't she pretty? She won this with a 63 Chevy 2. Now, driving a 63 Chevy 2, she had no seatbelt, no helmet, sponsored by the local Chevy dealer. This lady is 80 years old now, and she's our church secretary. I went and visited with her a couple of days ago when I was taking some stuff over to the church office. But that's just cool as all get out. That's the trophy she won racing that 60. And that car wasn't that old at the time. You know, notice how they painted the wheels half white and left them half brown so that you could see them spinning whenever she was driving along. But imagine this. Her driving with no helmet, no seatbelt. I don't know how fast she had to go to win that race, but that's pretty doggone cool. Well, that's all I got for you today. It's kind of a short video, but if you were watching it before you went to work, maybe it's time you went to work and made you some money anyway. And I'll see you guys next time.